There we go.
Good morning, folks. And I have a story to tell about a book full of stories and some more than that. Now, some of you, when you were in confirmation class or some kind of parochial school, probably learned the 66 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so forth and so forth. But they aren't all books. And when you get to the epistles of the New Testament, some are less than 1 page long. Can hardly call that a book, can you? Well, there are different kinds of books in the Bible. And the longest book is the book of Psalms, which wasn't finished until, 70 years after the time of Jesus. And it had to be put on 5 scrolls, it was so big. Well, there are different kinds of books in the Bible. Some books were written by people who knew the people they were talking about. If you would start in the 11th chapter of the 2nd book of Samuel and read through to the end of the 1st chapter of the book of Kings, you would find a story that was written by somebody named Nathan who knew the guy he was writing about. That's kind of unusual. But there were stories that were told long before they were written down. And in the New Testament, the oldest stories are the ones found in the Gospel according to Mark. Now, Mark never knew Jesus, but Mark traveled with somebody who knew Jesus from the time that Jesus was about 30 years old. And his name was Peter. And Peter told stories about Jesus. And Peter had a companion whose name was John Mark. Now, Mark is a Roman word, which means probably his father was a Roman. But John is a Hebrew word, which means his mother was Jewish. Well, Peter told stories about Jesus, and some of them are kind of embarrassing because there were things about himself that he didn't like to talk about. Anyway, Peter was captured and imprisoned and then killed under the Emperor Nero. And that's when Mark decided to write down all the stories he had heard from Peter. And we call it the Gospel according to Mark. Yep. But there were more stories. And there was a fellow named Luke who traveled with the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul didn't know any stories about Jesus at all. He had great and beautiful ideas, but he didn't know any stories about Jesus. And so when the Apostle Paul was left in Rome, Luke decided he had found this Gospel of Mark, and he decided to go and find more stories about Jesus than what was in there. And so he traveled and he found some of the best stories of all. And he found them down in the Jordan Valley, which flows from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. And there he found disciples of Jesus who knew some stories. So I am going to tell you some of the stories that are found only in the Gospel according to Luke. Okay, now we're going to start with a story that starts with a real thing. It says there was a young lawyer who decided to question Jesus. Now, Jesus was famous for his wisdom, and he called him teacher. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, what is written in the Torah? Now, the Torah are the 5 books that are sometimes called the books of Moses. What do you read there? And this young man said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to explain something because there was a puzzling question. Who is my neighbor? Well, that's a legitimate question, isn't it? Is my neighbor the person next door? Or just the people I know? Could it be anybody else? And so Jesus made up a story in order to tell the truth. Yes, you can make up a story in order to tell the truth, and such a thing is called a parable. Here's the way Jesus' story went, and you've heard it before, I think. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and oh, that's a long way down, because Jerusalem is about 2,000 feet above sea level, and Jericho is more than 1,000 feet below sea level. And this man fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest, an important person from Jerusalem, was going down that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise the Levite. Now, the Levites were sort of the janitors in the temple. When he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, now the Samaritans were supposed to be enemies of Jewish people for no good reason. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved to pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Now, they'd use olive oil to make sure the scabs didn't form, and wine was a disinfectant. It's an old-fashioned idea in that part of the world. Then he put him on his own animal, I suppose a donkey, brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, which in our money would be well over $200. And he said, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Now Jesus said to this young lawyer, which of these 3 do you think became a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? He said, I suppose the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do that. Now, Jesus made up a story in order to tell the truth. What kind of truth was he trying to tell that young man? Something bigger than he knew before. And here's another one of Jesus' stories that he made up. They're called parables. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. You know, he couldn't wait for his old man to die. So the father divided his property between him and his older brother. And a few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his money in foolish living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. Now, pigs are unclean animals to Jewish people. They won't eat pork. So he was probably over in one of the islands of Greece. And he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to eat and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Just treat me like one of your hired hands. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran up, put his arms around him, and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the slaves, Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was out in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. And this guy said, Oh, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. Well, what was Jesus trying to teach? Parables are stories that are made up in order to teach something. And Jesus wasn't the only one who told parables. There is a wonderful little book in the Bible, in the Old Testament part, what we call the Old Testament, called the Book of Jonah. And it's a parable. And in it, Jonah is trying to get away from God because God wants him to go and warn the people of Nineveh that something bad is going to happen to them if they don't change their ways. And Jonah remembers that the people of Nineveh were stinkers, and he doesn't want to ever forgive them. Well, it's a parable with a kind of a painful but funny ending. Yep. And there are more stories like that are stories told in order to tell the truth. Yes, we can do that. A story can be made up to tell people something very, very important. And there are other stories like that in the Bible. The last book of the Bible, called the Book of the Revelation, if you start with chapter 11 and 12, you'll realize, hey, this is a different kind of language. It's almost like Star Wars. But it's got a lesson in it that's very, very important. And there are quite a few stories in the Gospel of John like that, too. And the book of Daniel and the book of Esther are full of made-up stories, but they say something important. So the Bible is an interesting library. It's more than a book. It's full of things that are long and things that are short. And it's good to understand that. And sometimes there are more than one story about the same thing. Now, in the book of Exodus, there's a story about how Moses went up the mountain to get the laws of Moses, the laws of God. And he came down. And then later on, there's another story about it that's different. But whoever put the book together, and it was probably that guy named Ezra, who was a tradition expert, who lived about 500 years before the time of Jesus. And so to make people kind of sleepy or forgetful, he put 3 boring stories about the law between the first version of the story and the second one. And when we get to the old stories of creation, the oldest story is the second one, the one that we call the story of Adam and Eve. And the first one is later. So, lots of things in the Bible aren't quite what we thought they should be. But believe me, it's all good stuff. You just have to kind of learn to understand it. Well, that's all I have to say for you today. But stay safe, behave yourself, and get well.
Thank you, Pastor Hanson.
Well, we made it.